All right. Well, welcome, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us tonight for Chicago Area Peace Action's 42nd annual fall benefit. Before I frame the evening, I want to take a moment and recognize several elected officials who are supporting us tonight and who've been friends of CAPA for many years. State Representative Robin Gable, Mayor Daniel Biss, and County Commissioner Larry Suffredin. I want to make a special mention that Commissioner Suffredin will be retiring at the end of his current term in November of next year. Congratulations, Commissioner, on a sterling career and the deepest gratitude for your lifelong commitment to social justice, working people, and CAPA's mission for many, many years. I also want to give a shout out to our own CAPA Climate Group, who held a marvelously successful open mic event this past Sunday with multiple collaborating partners protesting pipelines number 3 and number 5. Look to your inboxes in the coming days and weeks for more to come on their work as they fight for the rights of Indigenous people to protect their sacred lands and water and demand full funding for critical climate action in the reconciliation bill. As I mentioned in our original announcement for this event, for years, Chicago Area Peace Action is focused on education, advocacy, and lobbying for enlightened public policy to make the world safer, more peaceful, and equitable for all of its inhabitants. This year, we choose to pause and shift our analysis inward in the recognition that it is impossible to plot a meaningful path forward without a thorough understanding of how we arrived at this place. At a moment when we are experiencing such fundamental national disagreement over who we are, who we were, and where we are headed as a culture and a society, I cannot think of a better time for us to pause and dive just a little bit deeper into some of the myths many of us grew up with and look for the hard truths that we were not only never taught in school, but that we as an electorate have shamelessly allowed to be whitewashed from the dominant political discourse. Myths about the United States being the indispensable nation, America is great because America is good, and that this nation somehow benevolently subjugates its self-interest in the service of peace and justice for all. All of this can make for a good night's sleep, a peaceful, wide-eye shut slumber through what Ta-Nehisi Coates has called the dream. But we, the people in this room, who have worked for so long and so hard to move this nation toward a more just, a more peaceful, and a more equitable path, we cannot sleep well sipping this Kool-Aid. For us, we need to know more about the uncomfortable truths of our nation's past. And so we turn to a brilliant young historian and author to help us peel back the layers of the behaviors and acts that built the world's most powerful military machine and the wealthiest economy, for some, on the planet. In his groundbreaking work, Professor Daniel Immerwahr provides an excellent recounting of the United States' drift toward and full embrace of expansionism and global empire, and its unmitigating efforts to minimize the optics of such egregious behavior. But rather than hear this simply from me, I want to cede the floor for 1 minute to hear from one of the most respected intellects working every day on issues surrounding the United States' role in an exceedingly and increasingly complex world. I give you Andrew Basovich, president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft.
Hello, I'm Andrew Basovich, president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. There are many histories of American expansionism. Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire renders them all obsolete. It is brilliantly conceived, utterly original, and immensely entertaining. Simultaneously vivid, sardonic, and yet deadly serious. It's a book I wish I had written. Chicago Area Peace Action plays a critical role in promoting change, moving the United States away from militarism and toward policies based on prudence, pragmatism, and restraint. Congratulations to all, and please keep up the great work.
Thanks again for joining us tonight. Please type into the chat where you're joining from tonight, if you're joining from out of town, and a very special thanks to the host committee. You may have seen their names at the very beginning of the event, but they're all in your program as well. See the program to look at a partial list also of what your support has helped accomplish this year. I think Marcia can drop the program link into the chat. And so now, one of the things we always miss when we don't get together in person, that I think is kind of a highlight of every year's event, is being able to stand around and chat with each other. So we're going to do that now in random groups. Marcia's going to post the discussion, a question for the discussion. I'll say it out loud. So what we want to talk about for about 10 or 15 minutes, just in our own groups to get us prepared for tonight's presentation, how do you think the US is currently perceived by other countries in the world? Are we the police? Are we liberators? Are we essential? Or are we the boogeyman? So I'll leave that for y'all to unpack in your own individual groups. And I'll see you back here in about 15 or 20 minutes. Thank you again.
So anyway, now it falls to me to try and articulate in just a few minutes what I could write chapters and chapters about. When Hassan El-Tayeb let us know 2 years ago that he would be leaving CAPA for full-time work in Washington, D.C., we were understandably a little bit nervous about who was going to fill those shoes. And then he said, "Oh, it's going to be great. I have the perfect person." And that was still a little solace. And then Lizzie Turner walked into our Peace and Justice Lives at CAPA, and Hassan's assurances were spot on. I don't have the space or time to go into each and every detail about how fortunate we consider ourselves to have had the opportunity to share the past 2 years with such a smart, motivated, organized, inspiring, and caring individual. Lizzie's helped us frame our thinking, organize our work, deepen our relationships and centers of power, and connect us on a very human level that is almost impossible to fully appreciate. It goes without saying that she will truly and deeply be missed. But we know she's only a phone call, or maybe a few dozen phone calls, no, just kidding, away. And really, what we know is that her time with CAPA was richly rewarding on both sides, and the knowledge and skills she gained here will serve her well for many years in the future. We are so proud to be a part of her development as a social justice warrior. And now the two individuals who are coming in to jointly take over her responsibilities as organizing director and student network director, well, we know their work intimately, as they have been a close and integral part of our foreign policy working group for well over a year now, leading campaigns on Palestinian justice and cutting the Pentagon budget. Their bios are in the program for you to peruse, but we are incredibly excited to begin this new chapter in the ongoing work of Chicago Area Peace Action and our struggle for a more just, peaceful, and equitable nation, and by extension, the world.
Well, thank you, Marcia. You almost had me start crying over here. Well, yeah, thank you, Marcia, again, and thank you, everyone that's here and that I've gotten to know over the time. It's really been a pleasure serving in this role. One of my favorite parts about being in this position has been being the mentor for our wonderful student chapters. CAPA's had some great student leaders over the years. We had quite a few graduate this past spring, but all of the former leaders did a great job at training new leaders that are filling some very big shoes very well as they take on new responsibilities and take on changing circumstances. You know, they spent the past year doing digital organizing, and now most of them are back on campus trying to do this hybrid thing on their campuses, and they're all doing such a wonderful job. So I'm so excited to pass the mic to them so you can hear a little bit about some of the work the students have been doing this year. We'll be starting with Samir from our DePaul chapter. And Samir, you should have screen share capabilities.
Gotcha. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Samir Mohammed, and this year I am the lead organizer for CAPA DePaul. Over the past year, we had a very positive year. Despite COVID, we learned a lot about digital organizing through Canva and through setting up Zoom meetings. So we are very excited to be back in person this year and having in-person meetings. And we're also very excited to apply our new digital skills and apply them to our in-person activities and events as well this year. Let me just move this down. So last year, one of our best events was the COVID-19 Behind Bars event. Essentially what happened during this event was it was during this past May, and we had a set of 4 panelists come onto our Zoom meeting. And essentially what they did was they talked about the conditions that incarcerated people are experiencing in the prisons during COVID-19. So they just kind of went in depth about, just the living conditions and how harsh it is for them and what we can do to help them. And this was a very positive and had a very positive turnout with 30 people that attended. So overall, it was a really good event, and we're very happy that we were able to do that. In terms of this year, our first meeting of the year happened just a few weeks ago, and we had a very good turnout. We had 16 brand new members, and 6 of them are freshmen. So we have a really good group of new and eager to learn students. So that was very exciting. And we've also had a very good recurring amount of students as well come to our second and third meeting too. So we've had a very good turnout so far, and we're really excited about that going forward. In terms of online activism this year, our first event is going to be Action Week. It's going to take place October 25th through the 29th. We've also had Action Weeks in the past, such as last year during October 12th through the 16th, and just previous Action Weeks as well before that. For this year, it's essentially what Action Week is that each day for a week, we touch upon a topic that we want to bring awareness to for other people. And we chose 5 topics, 1 for each day. So our topics include food justice, DePaul Chartwell's workers, which they are the service workers in our student center that, serve food and things of that nature. And I'm also very happy to announce that these Chartwell workers did receive all of their demands, because previously they were getting paid below the poverty line and they were receiving no benefits. But now they're going to be paid at $19.50 an hour, and that's going to increase each year. And they're also going to be guaranteed benefits and time off. So we're very excited to announce that. We're also going to be touching upon the humanitarian crisis going on in Yemen, as well as immigration reform and the prison industrial complex. And then in terms of future plans, we would like to get back onto our divestment campaign. Essentially what this campaign is that we want to get DePaul to release their financial reports, because there is a lot of evidence pointing towards DePaul funding Israel and just their military action. So we really want to get DePaul to release their financial reports so we can see that. Other events include teach-ins, specifically about conflicts going on in the Middle East. But those teach-ins could change depending on what topics are being spread around the news and things like that. We also would like to do pen pal letters to trans incarcerated folks. And then we also want to continue to pivot towards local community organizing. We want to make sure that we're really getting involved, not only through foreign policy, but also through our local community as well, and continuing to set a positive change for the people around us. But that's all I have for today. But thank you everyone for listening. And I'm very excited for what CAPA DePaul has this year.
Thank you, Samir. All right, so Lucille from CAPA Loyola will be presenting next. Thank you, Lucille.
Hello, I don't have a presentation, unfortunately, but I can share a flyer that I created for my school with you guys. So I am looking, I created this flyer to hang up around my school to get students involved, to just have some little basic information that doesn't take away too much from, like, doesn't distract them, you know, so they get a basis and they can reach out to me if they have any questions. So far, Loyola participation is a little smaller. We have about 10 members right now. So I definitely want to have more members. So I created this flyer to put it around and promote the club. We've had 2 meetings so far. The first meeting was to introduce CAPA to the students because they are almost all new students. I think we have 1 returning member other than myself. So we really want to educate people on what CAPA is. And so the second meeting that we had was beginning to discuss some potential campaign ideas to find out like what they're interested in. And it seems that they're super interested right now in line 3, which Liz works with, which is really awesome. And they're also interested in reproductive rights. So those are 2 ways we're thinking of going. And we're also looking at working with Samir, possibly at DePaul, on a campaign together, because we think maybe if we join together our groups, it could be nice to work with other students who also care about CAPA and helping. So we think it could be a really good community outreach. We are also, CAPA Loyola is hoping to recruit board members, looking for just officers and officer positions for people to get more involved with CAPA. And I've been talking with a professor at school who oversees us. His name is William French. He's very nice, very helpful. So he's been a big help, along with Lizzie and Charles, and Liz have been helping me a lot too. And I know the students are definitely looking forward to the Peace Summit that's going to happen, hopefully. They definitely want to work with other student organizations and like work with DePaul and UIC. So yeah, we don't have a whole lot going on right now, but this is what we have started and we're super excited.
Thank you so much, Lucille. All right, and next up we will have Jacopo and Andrew from CAPA UIUC.
Thank you very much. Just want to see if I have screen sharing privileges. We do have a presentation to share. I'm going to have to leave a bit early. It's going to be a little bit weird. I'm going to do this while I walk. We're going to make it work though. So I am Andrew White, the Vice President of CAPA UIUC. Jacopo, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, and I'm Jacopo Dominus, the co-founder and president of CAPA UIUC.
Fantastic. We're very excited to present our organization's work to you all. Just going to do a thing. There we go. Okay, so our slogan is very good at encapsulating what we aim to do. We are a coalition of citizens who share our commitment to peace through justice. So what we're trying to do is bring about peace through interdisciplinary action. We're focusing on policy, but the policies we're pursuing run the gamut of different forms of justice. Jacopo is going to talk about that in a minute, but the interdisciplinary portion of that means that we have people who are studying political science, environmental science. We have people looking into media and more of the hard sciences. And we're all working together to try to bring about a more peaceful future.
Yep, and 2 of our campaigns. So one of our campaigns is for the Justice for Black Farmers Act, which Senator Booker recently introduced in the Senate. And then another one of our campaigns is a completely grassroots, actually our own idea, to establish a Department of Peace Building in Chicago. So I'm actually going to put first a DOP petition that we created for change.org, if you guys wouldn't mind signing it, if you agree with it. And then I'll put the Justice for Black Farmers Act petition later. So basically, we embrace a peace building and justice-centric theory of change. So for example, we really emphasize restorative justice, truth and reconciliation, and distributive justice. So for example, with our Justice for Black Farmers Act, we believe that the history of land possession and land ownership in the United States is obviously extremely unfair, especially with regard to Native Americans and African Americans. So this act would seek to help address some of that injustice. And we also embrace, nonviolence and trust building throughout our activism and our work. So you can contact us at capa.uic@gmail.com if you have any questions.
Definitely. Okay, we wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about our campaigns. We got these a little bit out of order. Okay, so I'm just gonna do mine first. The one that I'm heading, I should say, we're both working on them. So this is the Justice for Black Farmers Act. It is a bill with a bunch of different provisions, but what we're most focused on is the one that aims to use $8 billion to buy and then at a fair market value, distribute land to prospective and current Black farmers. The objective here is to increase the amount of Black farmers and also work against the historical and current discrimination that occurs against Black farmers in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So our aim is to join the movement to bring this bill across the president's desk. Whew. Now we have Chicago Department of Peace Building campaign.
Yeah, so basically our Chicago Department of Peace Building campaign is to bring a DOP or Department of Peace Building to Chicago. It would basically enhance peace in the city through a variety of measures, including promoting economic growth in disadvantaged communities, creating a truth and reconciliation program to unite city residents from all communities throughout Chicago, and promoting a nonviolent and peace education in schools, which can include things like teaching all of history, as well as emphasizing nonviolent communication, all those things that enhance justice and a peace building mindset. And then we also have on the right side of the screen a basically a screenshot of a meeting we had with Dr. Lance Williams, who is a violence prevention scholar from Northeastern Illinois University, and he was sharing some of his work in violence prevention in Chicago. So that's something we're really excited about as well.
It's fantastic. Thank you to my president for such a great presentation. Thank you all for having us. I'm going to head out. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for listening, guys. Thanks.
Thanks,
Andrew.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our great students. We'll be shifting in our program now to the Robert A. Cleland Award, which will be introduced by Mike Lynn.
Hi, Lizzie. Thank you. I have the great honor and pleasure of introducing the 2021 winner of the Robert A. Cleland Pursuit of Peace Award tonight, Kathy Kelly. And I'd originally prepared kind of a vita of Kathy's whole career as an activist, but I realized if I really did that, I'd be here till well past midnight and nothing else is going to get done all night. So I trashed that all together, and I'm going to go in a different direction. When I think of Kathy Kelly, I often think of a scene from the film Casablanca, the scene where Rick, the expat American and barkeep, is first meeting Victor Laszlo, who was the fictional head of the resistance to the Nazis in Europe, and he's expressing his admiration for him. And Victor Laszlo says, "Well, thank you, I try." And Rick says, "We all try, you succeed." And that's kind of how I feel about Kathy Kelly and all the years that I've known her and known her work, is that we all try, we all organize, we all write letters, we all campaign, we march in rallies, we do a lot to try and change the world. Few of us, though, I think, actually risk everything the way that Kathy Kelly does. Kathy has consistently put her body and her life on the line for causes. For those of you that don't know about what Kathy has done, she goes to places most of us would never think of going. Afghanistan, the Iraq-Saudi border, for 14 days at the beginning of the 1990 Gulf War, Palestine, places we would probably be hesitant to go. So Kathy is a paradigm of the kind of courage and conviction that we all strive for. And at least for me, I usually fall short of my own expectations and certainly fall short of what Kathy has achieved. And there's something else that Kathy did that I think is truly remarkable. I would wager a lot of money that I could walk into any political, social, environmental meeting of any sort of group on the political left in Chicago of any stripe and mention Kathy's name, and there would be universal, yes, good person. We love Kathy. Kathy's great. And having been members of a lot of these groups over the years, I think Kathy deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for that alone. But that's something of an aside. One of the things that I think Kathy does is I think she provides a lot of not just support, but inspiration for people. The fact that Kathy has this constant commitment to the possibility that a better world is possible has always inspired me, because no matter what happens, Kathy keeps plugging away. She's still out there putting her body on the line, spending 3 months in prison for protesting the School of the Americas. For those of you who don't know, that used to be a military training installation in Georgia, where the US trained the troops and the torturers of a lot of Latin American governments. It was very controversial. There were yearly protests. People would cross over into the school, get arrested, go to jail. Kathy spent 3 months in prison, and I'm just wondering, how many of us would be willing to go to prison for 3 months to support, the kind of the causes that we believe in. It's her steadfast belief in justice and this willingness to put everything on the line that I think makes Kathy such an appealing and inspirational character. And I'm really pleased to see her getting this recognition. Sometimes people aren't appreciated in their hometown the way they should be, the way they are appreciated not only around the country, but around the world. So it's good to see Kathy receive this honor. And Kathy, I am so pleased and honored to be able to present this to you, and congratulations.
Well, thank you so very much, Michael, for that kind and generous delivery of the award. And I also want to say that when I was a young teacher at St. Ignatius College Prep, there weren't textbooks that I could bring into the classroom about peace and justice. So I would bring in Bob Cleland's newsletter, and so many of my classes were shaped around Bob Cleland's newsletter. And I think I helped talk myself anyway into a more radical perspective. And so I actually thank Bob a great deal, and all of his family members as well, for helping kind of nurture me toward a point where I quit teaching. I found myself sitting on top of a nuclear missile silo site. I had just planted corn on top of that missile silo site, believing land was meant to grow corn and wheat. And this was part of a joint action of many other Midwesterners. We were sure we had to take a stronger step in regard to the terrible militarism and the threats of nuclear war. And so I was arrested, but initially 4 soldiers came, camouflage and helmets and combat boots and rifles and walkie-talkies. They surrounded the site and gave me orders on what I was to do. But then 3 of them took off and left 1 soldier with me who had a gun, aimed at me. And I think I lasted about 1.5 minutes in silence. And then I started to talk and tell him about why we had done what we did. And, at one point I then asked him, "Do you think the corn will grow?" And he said, "I don't know, ma'am, but I sure hope so." And now I'm handcuffed, right? And then he asked me, "Ma'am, would you like a drink of water?" And I said, oh, yes, please. So if you can imagine, there weren't bottled water realities in those days. He had a canteen and he said to me, ma'am, please tip your head back. And I did. And that soldier squeezed the water from the canteen and poured it down ma'am's throat. And I think actually that was one of the best lessons in my life. I mean, he did an act of kindness for a complete stranger, but also it was an important lesson because, this fellow's job is to guard the nuclear weapon, right? And here's somebody who's sitting on top of the nuclear weapon as an act of protest. But he took the time to say that giving ma'am a drink of water was actually the most important thing to do. And what if in our world today, like the DePaul students who in past years have said, getting water to children in Yemen is more important than protecting our weapons? What about with all of the 800 bases we have all around the world, if we could say, no, getting water to children in Flint, Michigan, who can't drink clean water is more important than protecting our obscene and our pernicious and our terrible weapons? What if we were able to say to children and future generations, we want you to have water? And so we're going to educate ourselves to learn how to cope with climate catastrophe. And we're no longer going to let the military constantly have the upper hand, because we realize that there can't even be a rational discussion about climate catastrophe and pandemic and the terrible prison industrial complex and all of the things that plague our society if we don't dismantle the militarism. So I'm so grateful to Peace Action, because steadily you confront the militarism, you don't accept the militarism. And I'm so pleased to see you challenging the bases, the terrible, terrible extension of bases all over the world. Do you know there were 500 United States military bases in Afghanistan alone? And so my young friends from Afghanistan say so wisely, blood doesn't wash away blood. So Robin Kimmerer writes about a hunter who had a very big, successful hunt. He had loads of meat, and through an event, and I mean, I'm a vegetarian, so I don't want to say that this is pro-eating meat, but he threw an event and everybody had plenty to eat. And an anthropologist asked this hunter, don't you think maybe you should have put something aside for some time when you might not have as much meat as you have had tonight? And the hunter leaned back and said, I store my meat in my neighbor's belly. So I hope that will be true for all of us. That we'll store our education, our goodness, our dreams, our hopes, and all of our many, many talents in one another, recognizing we are all part of one another. Lizzie, I wish you well at every step ahead for your future, and to Charles and Liz, it's so great to see you come aboard. So everybody in, nobody out, and let's look forward to working together. Thank you.
Okay, well, Kathy, to say you're an inspiration is just not enough. Thank you so much for all you do. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So Kathy does action. Our next speaker does instruction, information, and he is the main event coming up. So you can see my name is Timmy. I live in Evanston. I'm born and bred here in this town, and I am an NU graduate many years ago. I've been a follower of CAPA and its immediate predecessor, NISP, ever since the days of crammed meetings in Marcia and Andrew's dining room. Although it's sad that we can't gather in person for, oh, you all don't know what you're missing, the wonderful hors d'oeuvres and dinner together, which we always had in the many years now in a nice big school gymnasium. I'm pleased that we're all here now, even if it is virtually, to give a hearing to tonight's speaker, who is Daniel Immerwahr. I was lucky enough about 2.5 years ago to be among the dozen or so people who first met him in the back room of that wonderful bookstore, Bookends and Beginnings, in downtown Evanston, just across the alley from what used to be Marshall Fields, some of you will remember. Now, Professor Immerwahr is a nationally recognized groundbreaking historian. His background was amply described in the invitation to tonight's event, but I'll just mention a few things. He has a BA in history and philosophy from Columbia University, a second BA from King's College at Cambridge University in England, a doctoral degree in history from the University of California at Berkeley, for which his dissertation won the Allen Nevins Prize in American Economic History from the Economic History Association, and another important prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. So he's right up our alley. I could go on and list the rest of his truly remarkable prizes and awards that he's received over the last half dozen or more years, but most of us are capable of finding that on the internet. Even I can. What's important here now, I think, is to appreciate how well his essays, and especially his recent book, How to Hide an Empire, help us see our country in the context of the wider world. We Americans are not an island unto ourselves. Our fingerprints, or our boot prints, if you will, reach across the globe. So thank you, Professor Immerwahr, for finding the time to join us here tonight. What with CAPA's focus on peacemaking and especially its cultivation of young anti-war activists at nearby universities, you couldn't have picked a better audience. So thank you, and please proceed.
Thank you so much, Timmy. That was wonderful. I remember that. I remember Bookends and Beginnings. That was my book launch. It was wonderful to see then, and wonderful to see what's come of it. Thank you all so much for having me, and thanks particularly to Lizzie, Marcia, and David for setting this up. Timmy, you described this as the main event. It's absolutely terrifying to be a main event if you have just been preceded by Kathy Kelly, who just gave a wonderful talk. So I hope that I will not entirely ruin the mood, but maybe we can talk about some history. I'm going to attempt an act of technological proficiency, and I'm going to try to share my screen. In my experience, this is going to look weird at first, and then we will fix it, and then it won't look weird. So let's see what happens. Okay, that's looking weird, but I think that looks okay. Yes, thumbs up if you, yeah, something like that. Okay. I'm a historian, so I'm going to start with the past. Some of you may remember this. In 2000, a young candidate for the Republican candidate for the presidency, a governor, George W. Bush, was trying to convince the country that he should be president. And he got quizzed by a journalist who just sort of, as like a series of gotcha questions, asked him to name a number of foreign leaders whose countries had been prominent in the news, and Bush could name none of them. And so it was thought that perhaps he's a little weak on foreign policy. And Bush got very nervous about this. So he gave a speech at the Ronald Reagan Library, his first foreign policy speech that was kind of to set the tone for who he was as a foreign policy intellectual. And he, debuted a few things, firmer hand in Russia, more trade with Japan, that kind of thing. But then he got to the point, which is how he saw the country. And he put it like this: America has never been an empire. We may be the only great power in history that has had a chance and refused. So here's a young and kind of unsure of himself candidate grasping for the soul of his own candidacy in the realm of foreign policy and for the heart of what America's presence in the world means. And he decides that it's anti-imperial. And that's not, I think, an unusual decision. In fact, there's a sort of long history of presidents throughout the 20th century saying some version of this, making some version of a claim that the United States has never been an empire, the United States covets no territory, the United States has no aspirations for the lands of its neighbors. I mean, it really just goes on. You can almost go through every president in the 20th century and into the 21st and get some version of this. It's sort of embarrassingly monotonous. We covet no territory, we covet no territory. And when you hear this from so many different presidents across the aisle, it's sort of a hallowed bipartisan presidential tradition, you start to wonder, why are they all saying this? And one possibility, in fact, a good possibility, maybe it's true. Maybe they're just all saying it because it's true. But the other possibility is this is the lady doth protest too much methinks situation, that there's a kind of performance being given, sort of ritualistic incantation as a way of warding off an uncomfortable truth, which is that in many ways, the United States is an empire. And I would like to explore that second possibility with you. Look, I'm a historian. So when presidents, as some of them do, make the historical version of the claim, as Bush's version is here, it's flatly wrong. It's really hard as a historian to entertain the idea that the United States historically hasn't been an empire for some fairly straightforward reasons, which I will just sketch out. The first is that the country's predecessor colonies began as well as colonies, as groups of colonists who were coming from England and were coming into lands owned by native peoples, in this case, the Pilgrims landing in the Wampanoag Confederacy. And I mean, it was firmly understood that what was going on here was the implantation of British Empire on indigenous lands. One version of the historical claim we make is that we say that these people, these colonists or colonizers, then threw off the shackles of empire when they staged a revolution. And that's kind of true. If you think about empire as being an imperial relationship between Britain and the new United States, that was severed. But if you think about the relationship between these colonists and native people, that remained entirely intact. And you can think, in fact, of the United States as a kind of successor empire to the British Empire in North America. This is a map I made of the United States. We usually think of the United States, like its name says, as a union of states, all kind of joined together, self-governing. But in fact, from day one and until the present day, and in every day in between, the United States has been not just a union of states, but an amalgam of states and territories. And a lot of those territories, despite the kind of national mythology about them being quickly upgraded to states, have been territories for decades, for a very long time in their history. And the reason is not because they've been empty of people just waiting for settlers to come in and establish a government. It's because of who lived there, and particularly indigenous people living there. And the fact the states that took the longest, or the territories that took the longest to become states, were those where most native people lived or had been pushed so that they lived there. The United States, by its own count, over the course of the late 18th and 19th century, fought more than 1,500 military engagements with indigenous adversaries, mainly in the territories. And I'm sort of taken by this statue, which used to be on the steps of the US Capitol, just showing a man modeled on Daniel Boone wrestling with an Indian, with an indigenous man. This was kind of what the country was about in a very forthright sort of way. This Daniel Boone figure was, on the steps of the Capitol as a sort of founding father. And this is a history that's still with us, still very much with us. The United States has within its borders about, I think it's 574 federally recognized tribal nations. And if you take all the Indian reservations in the United States and mash them together, you're talking about a land area roughly the size of Idaho. And it's not even just that. Very quickly after the United States expanded its borders through a series of wars, purchases, and indigenous dispossessions, to the point where it filled out sort of this familiar profile, it kept expanding. In fact, this map that we're used to, that we sort of call to mind when we think about how the United States looked, this map only corresponds to the country's borders for 3 years. There's only 3 years of US history where that's the map. 1854 to 1857, if you're curious. And the reason is that very quickly, excuse me, I double slides, that very quickly after the United States filled out that familiar shape in 1854, it started expanding overseas. First by taking a series of uninhabited islands known as the Guano Islands for their nitrate-rich fertilizer that they contained in the Pacific and the Caribbean. Here's a map I made of them. When I say a series of them, that's actually something of an understatement. The United States claimed nearly 100 of these over the course of the 19th century. Very quickly, it took the inhabited and enormous territory of Alaska. In the end of the 19th century, the United States intervened in a war that Spain was fighting with its colonies. And instead of, at the end of the war, freeing the colonies as it had promised the anti-Spanish rebels, it instead became a successor empire to Spain, annexing the Spanish colonies of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and taking in a sort of fit of imperial enthusiasm the non-Spanish lands of Hawaii and American Samoa, and occupying Cuba at the same time. By the middle of the 20th century, this is what the United States looked like. This map just shows every area as sort of flatly black, so you don't see sovereignty distinctions within the United States. You don't see all the native reservations. But what you do see is all of the land, and all of the land shown in a way you don't always see it, which is to scale at an equal area projection, all of the land that the United States has claimed. I mean, you want to say beyond its borders, but in fact, these are the borders of the United States. The thing that I usually have been trained to call the United States, that familiar shape, in fact, when you look at this map, you can see is only part of the United States. It's a big part, it's a privileged part, it's a populous part, but it's not the whole of the country, because the US Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines at that point had been a US colony, and it's enormous, American Samoa, Guam, Alaska, and a number of these uninhabited islands that the United States still maintained claims over, they were all also part of the United States. When you look at it like that, it becomes hard to understand how historically you could make the claim that the United States has not been an empire. What was the Philippines if not a colony? But thinking about the kind of forward-looking version of this claim, the United States isn't an empire or no longer covets territory. Well, what would we think of that? I think that also is a hard claim to fully buy. And it's a little complicated because the United States doesn't go on sort of territory acquiring binges in the way that it used to in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. But it does have other forms of power, some territorial, some non, that mark it as distinct from other countries. It is not really a nation among nations. It is a very special kind of country, and one that I think it wouldn't be crazy to identify as an empire. One thing that we can point to is something that Kathy Kelly already mentioned, those 800, as far as we can tell, military bases. Here's a map I made of them. It's a little hard because when the bases are very next to each other, or are close next to each other, you just see one dot or a squiggle, but often, some of those dots mean, dozens of bases. But what you can see in this map is that the United States has military bases all over the planet. It is hard to be a country that doesn't either have a US military base in it or isn't in some ways surrounded and potentially menaced by the US military bases. Now, this isn't the same kind of large colonial claims with large amounts of land. If you mash all of the base sites together, we're talking about a land area roughly the size of Houston. But nevertheless, these are incredibly important for the countries where the bases are stationed. It is impossible not to have to contemplate the fact that if you live in Japan, for example, that there have been military bases all over Japan since World War II. It's not just these sort of little specks of semi-sovereignty that the United States has all over the planet. It's also other forms of power, some strictly economic that don't really show up on most maps. Its corporations have spread out comfortably all over the planet. It has a kind of control over global commerce and finance that is not just unrivaled, but sort of out beyond its own size as a country. It has a kind of commanding power at institutions like the World Bank and the IMF that is even disproportionate to how much of the global economy it controls. And then, and this is also something that doesn't quite show up on a map because it's an action, not a border, the United States is just constantly in a state of war, or if you don't want to call it war, semi-war, policing, whatever. The point is that the United States is sending troops, and those and not just sort of peacetime sort of aid troops, but is sending troops for the purposes of violence all over the map, kind of all the time. So the Congressional Research Service produced a list of everywhere that the United States, that US, the military has been deployed. Well, I'll just show you since the end of the Cold War. So not just deployed in peacetime, but deployed, to fight or to be prepared to fight. And so I'm just going to show you the list of all of those deployments. So all of those things that in a sort of normal way of looking at it would be called wars that the United States has been fought. Some of them are quite small, but nevertheless, you'll see a sort of constant stream of them. So this is from the end of the Cold War. It only goes up to 2016. So this is the list. No, actually, I'm sorry, this isn't the list because it wouldn't all fit on a page. This is just to 1996, 4. Each one of these, they're very small, but each one of these line breaks is a separate deployment. Macedonia, Iraq, Somalia, Bosnia. There's a lot of them. Okay, let's move forward. Well, now we're into 96, but just into 99. Bosnia, Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Cambodia, Sierra Leone. Okay, well, now we're into 2001. My God, there's just even more of them. East Timor, Yugoslavia again, Bosnia again, East Timor again, Sierra Leone again. They just keep coming. This gets you up to 2003. This is the list up to 2007. This is to 2011, to 2013, to 2014, 2015, 2016. And if you were to see the list up to the present, it would just be an equally long list, paragraph after paragraph, each representing, I don't know exactly what to call it, each representing a military incursion, each representing a time when the United States is willing to and is using force in foreign countries. And then beyond all that, there's this just sort of diffuse sense in which the United States expects to be not a country among countries, not a nation among nations, but to sit, as President Biden put it frequently, at the head of the table of international affairs, to be consulted on all matters, just as a sort of matter of fact, that's the natural place of the United States. And what's amazing is that can be a kind of widely accepted understanding within the United States, that Biden could campaign on this, restoring to the United States to the head of the table, to the apex of an international hierarchy, which the United States sits atop, in some ways, the rest of the world. I've been asked to talk about the costs of empire, and I haven't done that yet. I've just talked about the fact of it and all the many forms that it could take, and I'm leaving out a number of them. Maybe we can talk about them in Q&A if you'd like. But I would like to talk about the costs. When we talk about the costs of this empire of the United States, usually the first thing that gets said when we talk about it in the United States is the cost to US service members. And those have been extensive. If you total up all the US deaths from post 9/11 wars, we're talking about 15,000 people. Now, interestingly, the majority of those deaths have not even been to US service members. They've been to rather US military contractors. More of those have died than official uniformed service members. But nevertheless, putting those two categories together, we're talking about 15,000 people, which of course, I mean, is 15,000 too many. And you can imagine the pain of having one of these people be someone you know and someone you love. We can also tally it up, and this is how we often do it, in terms of just how much money has been spent on this. $8 trillion, as far as we can tell, which is an absolute, just typing out all those zeros, I got to the point where I thought, surely this is too many zeros, but it was not too many zeros. That's what $8 trillion looks like. And it is just kind of gobsmacking to think, what if we hadn't spent it on that? The United States had $8 trillion to spend, and this is what it spent it on? That was a terrible use of money. That's how we normally talk about the costs of empire, the costs in, as some people say, blood and treasure. But there are other costs, and I think costs worth discussing. One is what this has done to the character of the United States. Because if you're spending $8 trillion on warfare, it's not like all of it just happens overseas. There is a kind of blowback, a militarization of US society that we're dealing with the consequences of which we deal with on a daily basis as our police start to look more and more like occupying forces. We deal with it. And it turns out that training an enormous number of people to regard foreigners as some kind of enemy that could be killed, arming them, training them how to use all those weapons, subjecting them to possibly a number of traumas, and then just kind of letting them go has some serious consequences back for the United States at home. It's not entirely an accident that the largest act of domestic terrorism in recent US history, the Oklahoma City bombing, was committed by 2 Army veterans. It is not entirely an accident that of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, disproportionately, they've been service members and vets, and if not, have participated in the kind of military culture as, aspirational members of it, who deck themselves out in camouflage and can and do acquire the kinds of weapons that we normally would think of as being appropriate for militaries, but wildly inappropriate for just walking around. And nevertheless, such weapons suffuse the United States. Those are all things we can say, but I think actually the most important thing to point out is that the costs of empire are not mainly borne by the United States. In fact, there's something narcissistic about asking within the United States, what are the costs of empire, and asking what are the costs for the imperialist country. I think in some ways you're sort of participating in the same imperial sense of which places matter and which places don't, whose lives matter and whose lives don't. If we start to ask not just, how many US lives have been lost in the United States post 9/11 wars and how many total lives have been lost, we're looking at a much larger number, around 1 million lives lost, which is about 60 non-US deaths for every US death. That figure itself, which is kind of, a 60-to-1 death ratio just gives you a sense of what empire looks like. It's a remarkable asymmetry of power. And that number itself is sort of a vast understatement, because that's just a count of direct deaths in major war zones. And that doesn't count the many people who have died as a result of infrastructure like water and sewage and electricity being bombed out, who've been forced to dislocate and have acquired diseases as a result. In fact, it's almost impossible to toll up all of the lives lost and disrupted and dislocated by these wars. And that's part of the problem too, is just a sort of blithe sense that from the United States, the consequences of this, first of all, are quite obviously disproportionately borne by people outside of the United States, and kind of exist within the United States nebulously, uncountably. It's very hard to get your head around it. And I think that itself is a sort of fact about empire and a consequence of empire. The asymmetry of costs is part of what allows the United States to comfortably and confidently and non-controversially maintain this enormous infrastructure of force projection. Kathy Kelly was right to note the 800, as far as we can tell, bases in US territories and foreign countries that just never come up. Like, it's not the kind of thing that, it's not that they never come up. We're talking about it now, and I'm very glad we are. But if you listen to a presidential debate, this is not the kind of thing that anyone will mention. In fact, the last presidential debates we had between Biden and Trump, no one even mentioned the fact that the United States was at war. That was not mentioned once in any of the debates, because this kind of force projection just seems, from the perspective of the United States, natural. It's just a form of policing. And that, endows in the United States a habit of thinking of global problems, not as problems to be solved by help, but as security threats requiring military responses. One of the government agencies that is actually most thoughtful about climate change is the US military, and the US military is thoughtful about it because it runs all scenarios where it imagines all kinds of security threats to the United States that might emanate from the dislocations of that come with climate change, which I guess is true. It is true that climate change is going to create all kinds of political problems, but it is absolutely terrifying to me that the agency of the United States that's thinking the most carefully about what climate change is going to do to the planet is an agency that is primarily concerned with neutralizing threats. What would it look like if that $8 trillion were spent on helping people in need and understanding climate change as ultimately a situation that requires help, not just threat suppression? And that, I think, is one of the largest costs of empire, is that we now have a global governance system that is hierarchical. The United States is indeed, as Joe Biden has wished, at the head of the table. And so we have a superpower that is central to global decision making, and yet is not responsible in a larger sense to a global public, but is rather concerned with its own very narrowly construed interests which it often expresses as security at a moment of profound peril. There are things to be scared of in the world today. A lot of them have to do with the changing climate. There are things to be scared about today. The pandemic is an absolutely terrifying thing, and the United States has a kind of architecture and infrastructure of fear and responding to fear, and the fears that it responds to are not the ones we need to be worried about. And so much of the global conversation, just because of the fact of empire, the stark asymmetry of power, is taken up with the concerns of the United States, a country that has not demonstrated an ability to use its massive resources for truly collective projects. So that, I think, is one of the scariest costs of empire. And I thank you for your time in this, and perhaps we'll talk in Q&A if you'd like. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to add Nasha here to the spotlight. She'll be moderating the Q&A.
Hey guys, thank you so much for that, Daniel. And yeah, I'm going to start the Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, please drop it in the chat. I will go ahead and start. First and foremost, Daniel, can you please discuss the blockade of Cuba as an example of empire? Why has Biden not moved to liberalize following Obama's policy?
Yeah, I mean, so the ins and outs of it, I don't have anything interesting to say, mainly because I don't know a lot about it. But the United States has, it's not just Cuba. It has played this game or engaged in this practice of sanctioning regimes that it deems sort of problematic. And on the one hand, I mean, you could argue that, perhaps refusing to trade with a regime is a far better way of dealing with your disapproval of it than bombing it. But the United States it's not just the United States alone, it's its ability to control sort of global flows of things, and it's how active its corporations are, such that when the United States refuses to, with sanctions, another country by sort of refusing to trade with it, it can cause enormous debts, as it did to Iraq before the Iraq War. I mean, we don't talk enough about the sort of slow violence of the sanctions regime on Iraq that preceded the hot violence of the Iraq War and all the disruption that followed it. And that just has to do with the absolute centrality of the United States in the global economy, and its ability to do something that other countries can't do, which is not just to say, we don't want to participate in your government and we don't want to sort of trade with you, but the United States has an ability to lock, ice other countries out to the point where it becomes an existential crisis for them. There's also another component of this where if the United States ices you out from arms sales, it often floods your rivals with arms sales. That creates a sort of, because the United States sort of just has this lock on global arms sales, that can create both a lot of instability and a lot of security problems for those regimes.
Thank you so much. So we have another question. How do we get media outlets to begin to address the truth of empire? We are an empire, and as such, we are a bully on the international stage.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've been trying to beat my head against that problem myself. And one question I've had, and I mean it as a genuine question, and folks might have an answer, is about the E word. There is such a sensitivity about that, and you can see from all these presidents, we're never an empire, we never want to be an empire. There's such a sensitivity about that I have myself not been sure whether more is achieved by just insistently using the E word, naming it for what it is, or by just laying out the case and saying, if you want to call it empire, that's fine. You don't want to call it empire, it's a word. We can reserve that word for countries with colonies if you want to be a stickler about it. But look at these maps, look at the military bases. Like, you have to acknowledge that that's something. So that's one question I have. But my general sense is that this is just an 18-wheel truck. That there's no one thing that we can do, but there's a lot of effort and a lot of persistent effort and just sort of the work of organizing, the work of writing, the work of reading, that it's just going to take to sort of de-imperialize the mindsets of, or at least the mindset of the voting public in the United States.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Trina. Our dad was interested in the end of empire, the idea that we have made so many enemies abroad and spend so much of our wealth that we are inevitably struggling and collapsing, at least internally. Is that similar to past failed empires? Is the US on the verge of being a failed empire?
Yeah, I mean, what is a successful empire, right? Like, it's not like I'm rooting for the empire's success. That's a way that we have of talking sometimes. And we can sort of slip into the United States as an empire rhetorical mode. And then, are we Rome, is often the next question asked. And it does seem to be the case that the material underpinnings of the United States hegemonic power, its predominance in the world, are slipping. Particularly slipping with respect to China. And what that's going to mean, I don't know, or when the sort of final adjustment of that is going to happen. I mean, I think the happy version is that this is a moment when the United States isn't going to be a failed empire, but a successful, normal country. If we don't regard empire as a success term, we could welcome what people in the interwar period called, although unfortunately we often mock, a return to normalcy. After World War I, there was a lot of interest in returning to the United States, to not having a sort of fully global power projection. And we now kind of look back on that, or at least my high school history teachers did, and said, those jerks wanted to return to normalcy. They should have known Hitler was coming. But, I mean, looking back on that now, you just think, wow, what a great moment. Like, what a great slogan for a country, return to normalcy. So is the United States slipping in terms of its place in the power rankings? Probably. It's pretty sticky though. So, I mean, it has a lot, like, those military bases just don't go away overnight. It's other forms of power and privilege that it has could be sticky in the same way. The thing I'm most worried about is a kind of bumpy ride down, and a lot of lashing out and sort of exertion of force as a last resort to resolve problems that should be resolved diplomatically. But my hopeful part of this is that, yeah, maybe, like the British Empire once did, we can welcome the fact that the United States could grow, its heart could grow many sizes, even if its basing structure shrinks a little bit.
Thank you so much for your response. We have another question from Carrie Hall. In terms of military bases outside of Iraq and Afghanistan, are there any bases the US has withdrawn from in the past 10 to 20 years?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really important to get this, that the basing structure has been shifting a lot. And one of the reasons it's been shifting is that the United States gets kicked out of a lot of countries. So these basing agreements are, I mean, the caricatured and untrue version would be that the United States just plants its bases in Germany or Japan or South Korea or wherever and just refuses to move them. That's true of Guantanamo Bay, but that is generally not true. Usually the United States has to come to some agreement, or not, sorry, usually, in almost every case except for Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, the United States has some agreement with the quote unquote host country, which allows it to do this. And often US military bases kick up a lot of local resistance, which is why I think the anti-basing, sort of the global anti-basing movement is one of the most important levers against US power. And even within the US military, I mean, this is a really important thing to say. Generals are not fully committed to a basing structure of this size. A lot of those bases are there out of inertia, out of heavy lobbying from military contractors, that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of hope, especially if we can finally put a lot of US domestic public pressure on the issue, I think there's a lot of hope that the basing structure could be way smaller than it is. And I'm really taken by this book by David Vine called The United States of War, where he points out just how constantly the United States has been at war, not just since World War II, but just since its inception, fighting Indian wars, and then kind of in the Caribbean, and then moving on. And what he points out is that the constant impetus to those wars is the military bases, because once the bases are there, if they get attacked, then the United States has to counterattack. But also, once the bases are there, they just become an invitation to resolve problems with force. And so he suggests that one of the most important ways to temper the United States sort of constant at warness would be to roll back the military bases as much as possible. And one, not to go on about this, but one kind of intriguing and hopeful example of this is a country that's not particularly known for its pacifism, and it's not particularly known for getting along well with its neighbors, China, which has one foreign military base and has barely had any international combat in the past 40 years. I mean, there's all kinds of violence happening within Chinese borders. I mean, this is not a defense of the Chinese state, but China does not seem to be at all locked in the kind of constant warfare that the United States is. And that may have to do with the fact that it also does not have bases planted everywhere.
Thank you so much for the response. We have another question from Liz. What are your thoughts on the rising geopolitical tensions with China, especially with Taiwan? Does this reflect your case, and what can we do to avoid the risk of a hot war? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think that's there's a version of this where China moves on Taiwan, and US leaders have to kind of decide, if how committed they are to being the global superpower, because they've said that, if this happens, the US will scramble the jets and mobilize the troops. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much of great depth I have to say on this issue, but it strikes me that the rise in geopolitical power of China, which I'm not sure is to be cheered in its own right, may actually be an incredibly useful lever in sort of de-imperializing the United States, or at least adjusting the United States to a different global role. And it's not clear to me that would then mean that China is now in the position that the United States is in. It may actually just lead to a more multilateral world. And it's certainly been the case in the last 40, 50 years that the more multilateral the world has become, the fewer people have died of war.
Yes. Thank you.
And Ashra, just to be respectful of our speakers' time, Daniel, we could keep you here till 9 o'clock. This group would ask you questions for another hour and a half. Let's take one or two more questions.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Daniel, for continuing to answer my questions.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Yeah.
So I'm gonna give you 2 more questions, and then we will be done then. So we have a question from Charles. U.S. even declares its right. I'm sorry. We have hold on. Sorry, that was not a question. We have a question from Mary. Given the risk for future conflicts, wars over global resources, which are getting more limited, I'm worried that the issue you raised will worsen without trying to project the future. Can you speak on this?
Without trying to predict the future, I cannot speak on this. Yeah, no, I share that worry. The right now, look, there's 2 ways to look at it, I suppose. One is to notice that, despite all the challenges we face, that the world has been getting less violent over the course of the last century. And, it's hard to say exactly why, but that's really worth celebrating. We should say that, and we should, do everything we can to possibly continue the trend. And so there's a hopeful version of this, which is that if we keep that going, and especially if we're able to sort of impede or block or reform the most likely purveyors of violence, and the United States is the chief one in the world today, that we may see a world where we can imagine struggle over resources, and a human struggle that doesn't necessarily lead to armed conflict. I think that's the most hopeful thing. But yeah, everything I have from looking at the International Panel on Climate Change reports suggests that it's going to be a rough, half century ahead, and certainly after that. And I think that's all the more reason to regard with great urgency the task of removing violence as a sort of solution to a struggle over water or something like that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I know we don't want to waste your time, but I will let you go now.
Okay, it's been an absolute pleasure to be here and to talk with some of you, even in this weird way that here now is over Zoom. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think this was even more than we actually had hoped for. So what a fabulous framing in 21 minutes to take us through that broad sweep of history and bring us to the present day. Thank you so much. I do want to just riff off of one thing that you said as I close us out here, because I think this quote is attributed to a lot of different people, whether it was Abraham Maslow or Abraham Kaplan or Mark Twain who actually said it. I suppose it's tempting, if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail. And that concept holds a great deal of truth. And I think we've all been victimized as a nation by this narrow groupthink in Washington, D.C. policy circles. It has to change. And the only way it's going to change, it's not going to change because we wish it will change. It changes when we shift the dominant discourse in the public square. Having resources like you, having resources like Andrew Basovich, having people speaking these truths out loud, this is how we'll make the difference. And I want to thank everybody here today for their attendance, your participation, your ongoing support. And while we fundamentally object to the depiction of America as the indispensable nation, I hope everybody agrees that the presence of Chicago area peace action and scores and hundreds of organizations like ours across the country are absolutely indispensable to the health and well-being of an informed electorate and an enlightened nation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We look forward to working with you all again in the future. And thank you again, Daniel. It was fabulous.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, David.
Great program, everybody. Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. Very good.
All right.
Before everyone signs off, do you want to do a screenshot, take a group picture?
Sure. Do we still have Daniel here?
I think, yeah, he's here. All right.
We can get a screenshot. It would be great.
Smile, everybody. All right. Thanks, all.
Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, everybody. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A great rest of